I'm going to go through some of these comments. Really excellent advice here from people. So making sure you get the appropriate respondents, Theodora says. I think that's something that Edward says later as well. How do you select? Well, you need to be very clear about what your research question is and who's going to be the most appropriate people. I sometimes have students who come to me and they say, oh, I want to do a PhD, I want to interview academics. And I say, well, actually, you don't get to choose who you interview. Your research question dictates who you have to interview to get their perspective. So that it should kind of fall out from the research question, the research problem, more than just who you feel like chatting to. The venue, quite a lot of you spoke about the venue, very important. Sometimes you don't get to choose the venue because part of having a conducive environment, as Zaza says, and part of making people feel comfortable, as a couple of you spoke about, means making sure that it's a space where your respondents feel comfortable, and actually they are the ones you need to take into consideration. So sometimes that means meeting at the Mug and Bean. Then you've got all the background noise. So ideally, it's in a nice quiet office with the door shut, but for some people that is asking a lot of them in terms of having to get to the office, in terms of having to cope with the power play of working in an office. An office can be a powerful structure, especially if one person's behind a desk. So all of these things are important. When we talk about where to have the interview, it's not just the address of the venue, it's also how you set up the venue. Spend a bit of time thinking through what vibe you are giving off. It's about language, very useful. Language as in the actual language, the medium of the interview. Is it an appropriate language use? If you're asking people to think about complicated things or very emotional things and express those in a language that they are not completely comfortable in, it definitely limits the kind of information you're going to get. So then what, if you don't speak the language, will you use a translator? There's no yes, no answers to any of these. These are just things you need to not only consider carefully, but justify in your methodology chapter. Well, that's usually the place you do so. So it's not only to think through, well, if I use the translator, what are the implications? What will I win? What will I lose? How will it benefit the participants? How will it damage or benefit the data? Not only to think through those things, but to actually write those up so that the people reading your research get to see how you made those decisions, justifying your decisions. In the humanities and social sciences, we often have a lot of references, even in our methods chapter, because as we explain a decision that we took, we justify it in terms of the context of our study, or we justify it with evidence by referencing the literature to show that that is an appropriate way of doing it. Ethical clearance, indeed, you need to have ethical clearance before you interview anyone. You are not allowed to go and do interviews for research purposes until you've had ethical clearance from the institution where your study is lodged. And you may then need to get ethical clearance from other institutions as well, depending on the nature of your research. And then, as someone says, informed consent. Absolutely. That's different from ethical clearance. Ethical clearance is an approval of someone saying that, yes, your proposed study has considered ethical issues, and you have clearance to go ahead and do it. Informed consent, we have a separate section on ethics. I won't go through too much detail, but it's consent. Before you can interview people, people have to agree. But the first part of that phrase is just as important as the second. It's informed consent. People can't give consent if they don't know what's the interview for, who's going to be interviewing me, how long will it take, how will the data be used, how will I be protected and respected and treated with the due respect. All of these things need to be expressed. I often see informed consent letters that look like legal documents. I don't want to sit down and have a very open, sharing conversation with someone when it starts off with me having to sign something in triplicate and, witnessed on this day in blah, blah, blah. got to think about what you're trying to do. You're trying to have a conversation in which you are able to collect people's views, opinions. It might be on a fairly unprovocative topic, it might be on a provocative topic. Whatever it is, you want people to feel as relaxed as possible to speak to you freely. If you start that with a legalese ethical clearance letter in which you explain your study in all sorts of fancy academic language, you're not going to build up that trust and rapport that you need. Confidentiality, very important. People want to know, are they going to be offered anonymity? It's probably not confidentiality, by the way. If it's confidentiality, means that there are certain things you'll keep confidential, but confidential means you won't tell anyone. That's what confidential means. Keep it confidential. If you tell me this, I won't tell another soul. But of course you will tell people because you're going to be writing about it. So usually what we're talking about is anonymity. When I tell people about this, I will keep you anonymous. Do you also need to think about keeping the institution anonymous, the business that they're working for anonymous? These are all, there's no right or wrong, but these are all issues you need to think about. Making people feel comfortable. Esther talks about a sense of trust, hugely important. I'm going to really think that it's so important that we pilot these things. Pilot your interview first with a family member, then with someone who is similar to the person you're going to have to interview, but not actually part of your sample. So if you are trying to interview first-year students in history, maybe you can ask a first-year student in sociology to be a pilot, because you want to see, are your questions, is your manner going to work for those kind of people that are similar in age or whatever other important issues are pertain to your sample. And after you've interviewed them, ask them to tell you, how was the interview? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? What can I learn from it? What should I do differently? Taryn, avoid making assumptions and asking leading questions. Absolutely.
So I see qualitative interviewing as more like a conversation, but it's an unusual conversation. It's a conversation that is held between two people where the one person tries to take a back seat in the conversation whilst at the same time remaining attentive to the conversation and keeping the conversation going. So it's a very difficult form of interviewing.
I see interviewing as a means by which we gain entrance into people's worlds. It provides the researcher the opportunity to enter into people's worlds and understand their experience from their own perspective. One thing that made me fall in love with interviewing was that it offered the opportunity for the researcher to enter into a conversation with your participants.
I think the other thing that's very important for me is that we don't go into a qualitative interview with an interview schedule. I don't like to see people having a series of questions that they want answers to. I think it's fine to have a couple of bottom lines, things that you don't want to leave the room without having had discussed. But that's different to saying that you've got questions and you have to have the answer to the question.
The most important thing for me as somebody who does in-depth interviews is that when I approach an interview, I have one open-ended question that I ask my participants to begin off with.
You must always be prepared to expect the unexpected. By that I mean when I went with my questionnaires, I realized that everything that I had on my questionnaire, when I started to do the interviewing, most of the participants actually brought concepts, which were not in the questionnaire, So I had to kind of adjust to that.
to get at experiences of the phenomenon requires us to engage with the person as a human being, and to have a conversation which is unstructured and very difficult to prepare for. So you can't prepare a series of questions in the same way as it would be very weird if your friend asked you out for coffee and you then prepared for the conversation that would unfold.
I was actually happy to find things that I didn't expect, because, you know, at the end of the day, that's the whole point.
The other thing I've learned with doing interviews is that you need to be very attentive. You have to be an attentive listener. You need to listen with your mind and you need to listen with your heart. So as they are speaking, I've learned that I shouldn't interrupt them. I should let them speak, and only when they are done talking can I make follow-ups and ask them questions.
Also, I think it's important to let the participant talk rather than constantly interrupting the participant. I found that writing the questions down that come up as the participant is speaking was particularly useful for me.
So what is important about doing this then is that you need to be very attentive, in the sense that you need to be jotting down trigger words from what they're saying so that you can use them to make follow-on questions and seek clarification and seek further elaboration on what they would have said.
If you ask somebody how they experienced something, they might, for example, tell you that they found it challenging. Now, that is a trigger word for me, because it doesn't really mean anything. It's the kind of thing that people say. It's the kind of thing that just washes over us. It doesn't really tell us anything. We could have 15 different people telling us that something is challenging. We wouldn't really know what the nature of those challenges are, or why that person found it challenging, or why they chose that word, or what that word really means to them.
So I wait for the participants to finish or tell me a story about that particular phenomenon that I am investigating, and then later I ask questions like, so earlier you talked about emotions when interviewing. Can you tell me how you felt in that particular situation?
And so one of the things that is quite useful in qualitative interviewing is to listen for those outside voice words, challenging, passionate, and in those moments to follow up and to ask for more information.
So I think you could see there, I think that was quite useful, a whole lot of ideas. I love that idea of expecting the unexpected. I like the idea of, and I think both Renelle and Anthea have said that, you know, when you are more relaxed and conversational, you get better data. You actually have a much more free-flowing interview where you're very anxious and ultra prepared and you're so concerned about behaving properly and getting through your questions properly. It often comes across as more stilted and makes the person being interviewed actually feel quite anxious. And so, yeah, getting that right is quite a challenge. When do we use focus groups? When do we use interviews? I saw Ingrid had a comment about that. I think there's pros and cons of both. I wonder if any of you want to just use the chat bar to talk about the pros and cons of either. Interviews are one-on-one, and focus groups is where you have 2 or 3 or 5 people. Ingrid asked how many is the most. I've seen focus groups up to 10 people, but I think it really depends on the nature of the topic that you're talking about. Interviews are better if it's very confidential information. In focus groups, it's very possible to have a dominant voice, and then that person does all the speaking, and if any of the others speak, they just reinforce what that dominant person has said. But on the other hand, if there's a big power differential, if you're Professor so-and-so and you're much older, and this is, I find if I'm working with a group of students, if I have a group of young students together, they are far more likely to engage with each other and interrupt each other and talk and give me rich data than if it's just me and them, especially if it's once-off. If I'm going to have multiple interviews over time, you get a relationship with that person, and then the power, you can work against the power differential as you go. So that's just something to think about. But you're welcome to add more comments as you go. So yeah, power. Power is a big issue, and power is not an obvious thing. It may be a professor interviewing students, there's obvious power, but it's often much more subtle than that. It's around how you're sitting. Are you sitting behind a big desk? Are you sitting with sort of an open body, or are you sitting all kind of hunched up? Are you kind of aggressively in their space? Or are you, how do you relate to the person in a way that doesn't reinforce power? Of course, power is also in the language we use, and we spoke about that, not using a whole lot of academic terminology. Then this last bullet is an interesting one. How do you use engagement with people to keep them talking without necessarily being complicit? This happened in my own PhD. I had a lecturer who was actually making quite racist statements. Now, those of you who study linguistics will know the importance of etic devices to keep people talking. So those are things like, oh really? Sure, yeah, those kind of little noises that we make, or even just little nods of your head. Those are all ways that we respond to people and keep them talking, that we show that we're listening, we show that we value what they say. It's quite a difficult thing when people are saying things you totally don't agree with, but it's not your job to interrupt them and say, well, that's absolute nonsense, because you are trying to collect their experiences. I'm not saying there's an answer here, I'm just saying that there are these interesting issues. Esther talks about length of time, especially for focus groups. It takes a lot of time to transcribe. I'm going to move on to, I think my next slide is about transcription. No, I'm going to come back to transcription. Don't worry about spelling. There's chat. There's no rules about spelling in grammar and chat. It's like WhatsApp. You can write however you like. The research office might be willing to pay for a transcriber. I've had challenges trying to get transcribers paid for my students, I must say. There's benefits to doing your own transcription. It's very slow at first. If you're using a software program like Vivo, and by the way, we're going to offer an online course on learning how to use Vivo in a few weeks' time, or Atlas TI. Those programs are actually much better for doing transcriptions within them. But however you do it, doing your own transcriptions allows you to really get to know the data and makes the analysis much quicker. But if you're not good at typing, it can be a hassle, and you might end up paying someone if you've got the money. All the literature says if you can do your own transcription, it is the way to go. Ronelle says she found it invaluable, but it took hours and hours. You also decide how much transcription. Are you transcribing with all the linguistic devices to show interruptions and overlaps, or are you just going to do partial transcription, which is where you listen to the whole audio 2 or 3 or 4 times, and then you just transcribe the core issues.
Hi, I'm Belinda.
And hello, I'm Kolelwa, and we're both PhD scholars.
We're going to be chatting about a few things that you need to be taken into account if you're using written questionnaires or surveys to collect your data.
The first thing to consider is what information you need to collect. What is your research question? You'll need to have a strong sense of what data you're trying to get to answer your research question. Don't include items on your questionnaire just because you think a questionnaire should have them. Do you need to know your participants' names, or ages, or genders, or salaries, or workplaces? What you ask depends on what it is you're trying to find out.
Then you need to think about what medium will be best to use. There's loads of online software for developing quick internet questionnaires. Google Forms, for example, is really easy to use. It's free and it collates your data in visually appealing ways. And there's plenty of YouTube videos showing you how to set up a Google Forms survey.
But using an online form and sending out an online link assumes that your participants have internet and would be comfortable using the method. If your participants don't have online access, then you need to find another process. Maybe you have to post out paper-based questionnaires, but be prepared for very few people to complete them and send them back. It might be that you have to take the paper-based questionnaires to the participants and collect the data yourself.
In which case, you might be better off doing interviews where you can probe and add questions as you go in response to what your interview has said.
But perhaps your research design means you have to ask exactly the same question in the same order to each participant. Then a paper-based questionnaire might be exactly what you need.
And here there's few things you need to consider, like
how long will my participants be willing to spend on the questionnaire? It's no good asking 100 questions if the participants will only be willing to answer 5 or 6.
And it's not good using fancy words that the participants won't understand.
And you need to make sure that the participants have full information and provide their consent for the data to be used at the beginning of the questionnaire.
And you need to be sure to pilot the questionnaire a few times with people similar to your participants because they will no doubt find problems you have missed. It's useful to get your pilots undertaken in front of you using a think aloud protocol. This will often demonstrate where the problems lie.
What ice cream do I like best? Vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry? But I hate ice cream. So what am I meant to take?
And I like caramel ice cream. And that's not an option. Stupid question, right?
Yes, it is. Let's consider other stupid questions people sometimes put in their questionnaires.
The leading question, where the participant is kind of forced to take a particular view or assumption. For example, should consent parents attend their children's sporting events? Yes or no? This suggests that attending sports events is aligned to being caring, and it doesn't leave space for participants to point out why they cannot attend such events. Or this one, how much you think prices will drop? This leads to the assumption that prices will indeed drop. Or, what is the key problem with this policy? This assumes that the participant thinks there are problems with the policy.
And then there's the loaded question. These questions force the participant to respond without being able to contest the basic assumptions. So, for example, where do you go to party? This assumes the person goes out to party.
Double-barreled questions are ones where the poor participant doesn't know which bit they are being expected to answer. It's 2 or 3 questions squashed into one. For example, how satisfied are you with discipline and student support in the school, or are you not satisfied?
Then there's a problem with using absolutes in questions, like always, never, and so on.
Probably the most common error is having questions that don't make complete sense to the participant. They are either ambiguous or vague or uses complicated language. For example, asking students to answer the question, do you feel you have scaffolded support in your acquisition of academic literacy practices?
There's a multiple answer question where 2 or more answers could be right for a participant, but the system only allows them to choose one. For example, do you go to the shops during the week or on the weekend? Maybe I go shopping on both, but the system only allows me to choose one. Yeah.
There's the insulting question, and this can be difficult because you have to have a sense of what your participant might prefer not to say. For example, some questionnaires make people choose their title from Prof, Doctor, Mr, Miss, and there would be a lot of people who do not use any of these titles.
Then you need to think about the flow of the questionnaire. and the best structure that will make sense to the participants. Often, these are only issues that can only be ironed out with lots of piloting.
We hope we've raised a few issues for you to consider as you go ahead and design your questionnaire. You can find some more materials about questionnaire design below this video.
Bye,
and
good luck with your studies.
There you have it. I think some quite useful things, but maybe if there's not, and there's some really good resources online that you can look at around double, loaded questions and double-edged questions and so on. But the truth of it is you need to pilot. And think about, when you're putting together your questionnaire, you'll be thinking about what you want, but then you need to look at it and think about it as the recipient. Think about how they'll understand it. And that's where piloting is so important, especially with the piloting with a group that's similar to the group you are going to finally be collecting data from. Why would you use a questionnaire or a survey? Because you want more data. Often people use a combination. They use a survey, which they're very widely spread, to get a sense of the full sector, or they sort of to map how the issue arises over the whole area. Then they use the results from that survey to decide on a couple of issues that they want to hone in on in much more detail through an interview. The opposite is also true. If I think of work that Evelyn is doing, and I think Evelyn's with us right now, but Evelyn's done a study where she started off at Rhodes University and did very in-detail interviews with people. Having understood the particular phenomenon at Rhodes University, she's now putting together a national survey to see what that issue looks like across other universities. So it could be either way, but generally speaking, an interview will allow you to go much deeper, but maybe not be able to generalize as broadly across the whole population, whereas a survey allows you to go wider. Surveys have a much lower participation rate than interviews, though. Generally speaking, if you ask 10 people to be interviewed, 8 of them will probably say yes, depending on how you approach them. Whereas if you send out 100 surveys, maybe 10 people will respond, again depending on how and who you're sending them to. Sending cold call interview requests and cold call survey requests, in other words just anonymous, very low response rate. If you can send it to someone, individual email, asking them, address them by name in the email, making it clear that your connection to them if possible, like, my supervisor, Professor so-and-so, suggested that I contact you. If you can make it more, they're much more likely to respond than if it's just a blanket email that is anonymously sent to loads and loads of people. I guess it's just human nature. If it's more work and I don't know who this person is, and it's not even just sent to me, it's been sent to hundreds of people. If you ever are sending an email to hundreds of people, or even more than a couple of people, make sure you put all the addresses in the BCC, in the blind copy line, so that nothing is more annoying than getting an email that is sent to 60 academics across South Africa, and all of our email addresses are there in the to bar. That's considered a sort of a bad privacy issue. If you're sending an email to loads of people, make sure you put their addresses in the blind bar. But ideally, you would send an individual email to each person, especially for interviews. Snowballing will definitely help, I agree. If you have an interview with someone, at the end of the interview, say, that was so useful. Do you know any other first-year students in sociology that might be willing to chat to me? And then when you approach that next person, you can mention that their friends suggested that you get hold of them. Because again, I really should allow an hour and a half for these, but I know a lot of people have had to leave already. Let me see if there was anything else that I felt I really needed to say. We've spoken about that. Oh, just a small issue, by the way. If you get a transcriber that's not yourself, if you hire a transcriber, make sure that they sign an anonymity letter. You've promised your participants that only you and your supervisors will see the data, and now you're giving it to a stranger. Now, most transcribers would not even know who these voices are on the tape, and they couldn't care. But just in case, especially in a place like Grahamstown, it's a small village, and you recognize someone's voice and they end up saying something confidential, make sure that the person who does your transcription signs a simple form and indicating that they will not repeat anything that they hear anywhere else. And as I said, your data, a lot of people write in the informed consent that they are the only ones who will see the data, but your supervisors should have access to your data. So don't promise that you're the only one who will see it, because your supervisor can certainly, your supervisor might not bother to see it, but if they want to, they may well want to see it. And also be kind to yourself. Your first few interviews aren't going to be great. You'll get better. If things go wrong, don't panic. Things go wrong in conversations, and that's really what an interview is. It's a conversation with someone about a phenomenon. And I think that little video that Grace made really showed that. Have your one or two bottom line issues you want to make sure you cover, but apart from that, just let the conversation flow. And if things go wrong, well, you make another plan. If you forget, if your recording doesn't work, as soon as you find out that your recording didn't work, I must say I'm inclined to have two phones recording, just to be sure. But if your recording doesn't work, just quickly write down field notes of everything you can remember. It might make it impossible to use direct quotes, but you've still captured the data. In fact, that was the norm not that long ago. People never had little handheld recording devices. People used to take notes. I think it's nice not to have to take constant notes. It's good to have pen and paper when you're doing an interview to jot something down, but constant notes takes your attention away from the person. As usual, kind of rabbiting to the end. So that's really just a few opening suggestions. I doubt you heard anything you hadn't heard before, but just nice to have a space to think these things through, I think. But we haven't spoken about what you do with that once you've got that data. And that we're going to talk about on the 28th of April. We're going to talk about now, how do you make sense of all of this? To analyze the data, because you can't just sum it up and give it to your reader. You need to actually analyze it. And what does that mean?